Hi everyone, welcome. In this video, I am going to be showing you how to make an A-line skirt with an elastic waistband. For the first minute or so of this video, you will see me drawing visuals of what it is that I'm going to be doing. For this A-line skirt, I'm going to use a single cut of fabric that I'll be doubling over because I want to cut two pieces, and it's a good way for me to conserve fabric as well as save a little bit of time by doubling my fabric over and cutting once and then ending up with two pieces. So I'm drawing that out here along with the measurements. I'm going to be making a skirt that fits up over the hips since it doesn't have any kind of closure like a zipper or buttons. It's just going to be elastic, so it needs to be able to come over the hips, and it's not stretch knit fabric, it's just woven fabric. So I'm just making a diagram here on the paper of what it is that I'm going to be doing. This may be something you find helpful just so you can work the numbers out before you get started, so that in the process you're not using the wrong calculations and cutting your pieces wrong. Here are the completed drawings, and now I'm going to go directly to my fabric and begin the skirt. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and mark the fabric and cut out the pieces for the skirt. And first, just let me show you the materials that I'll be using. I have my ruler here. This is an 18-inch ruler. I stated in another video where I posted on the screen that I've had this, I don't know, for 20 plus years. I've had this since I was in school for design back in the day. I have a tape measure. I have this chalk holder, which you can put little pieces of chalk in here and use to mark your fabric. I've also had this for many years and I love it so much, but the issue is that I have no more chalk. I haven't had any for a long time, and I have not really investigated where to buy chalk. When I lived in Louisiana, I would just get it from Joanne Fabrics, which is where this came from. It was a kit that came with the chalk, and then you could get refills. But now that I am no longer living there and don't have access to Joann's where I currently live, I don't have the chalk. And as I said, I just haven't really looked into where to get it. So this is great. You know, you can push it up, adjust the chalk, etc. So since I don't have that, I basically just use a crayon from my daughter's art kit, and this will work just fine. And I also have scissors here. All right, so if you remember on the drawing that I did, I just drew images of what I'm going to be doing here. And so I'll just repeat those steps, but on fabric this time. So I have my piece of fabric here. This fabric is about 44 inches wide when you open it up. So if I measure this across, it measures about 22 inches. And that's pretty standard for woven fabrics, 22 inches. If you were using knit, it could be wider than that. I'm sorry, 44 inches wide. And then my piece of fabric here is, and so this piece is measuring 44 inches long, which will make it be in the 20 to 21 inch range once I'm done making the skirt itself with the hem and everything. And I've gone back and forth about whether I'm going to do an attached waistband or just create the waistband out of the skirt itself. I think I'm going to go ahead and make an attached waistband to show you to do that. Okay, so we'll do that when we get to it. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and draw my markings on the fabric. So you see I just folded it in half like I showed you on the diagram. And this is the folded edge over here. And then on the other edge, that is the selvage. That edge won't fray, it comes off the bolt like that, and that's called the selvage. We're dealing with a fold here and also a fold here. Because I am trying to conserve fabric, the way that I do it is just fold it over to create the two pieces, and then I cut this open when I'm done, and you'll see me do that. All right, so let's go ahead and mark this fabric. Okay, let me explain something really quickly about these measurements. Now, because this is woven fabric and I am not putting a zipper in it, I'm not putting buttons in it or any kind of closure, the top measurement needs to be the hip measurement. so that you can pull this up over your hips for it to rest on your waist once you get the um, elastic in. So I used a hip measurement of 44 inches and I divided that into 4 because this piece here, you'll see it better once I cut it. This piece here is going to be, when it's unfolded, it'll be 22 inches wide at the top, and so will the other piece. So 22 plus 22 will be 44. Now, if I were making a skirt that has a zipper or like a button closure, I would make this measurement up here match the waist, whether it be the natural waist or like wherever you want your skirt to sit. Some people like things to be a little bit more lower than the natural waist. So this measurement will be that. Also, if I were using a knit fabric, a fabric that stretches, I could also make this closer to the waist measurement because I could get it up over the hips without problem because it stretches. But because this fabric has 0 stretch to it, I am just going to be using the hip measurement and elastic to make it draw in and be closer around my waist area once it gets over the hips. Okay, so keep that in mind. I'm using woven, and that is why this needs to be wide enough to go up over the hips because there will be no stretch. You do have some woven fabrics that have a little bit of stretch to them. You may be using that. Also, just on the point of fabric selection, which I haven't talked much about, this fabric is very thin. I typically would not make a skirt out of this. However, I am just using fabrics that I currently already have in my collection. This is pretty thin, and it's okay. It's okay. But you know, depending on the color, or even just in general, you may want to line fabric like this if it were going to be worn as a skirt because it is so thin. But I'm not going to be lining it today. I'm just going to make the skirt. Just to show you the basic steps to making an A-line skirt. But typically, for me personally, I would say that this is kind of thin to wear as a skirt. Maybe one of my children could do it, but I'm still going to use this fabric, and it's okay. It's actually my favorite color. I love green. I love different tones of green, and this is one of my favorite colors of green. Okay, so I marked this up here going over to 11. And at the bottom, I marked this going over 13 inches to create my A-line shape. Now, there's not much difference between 11 and 13, only a couple of inches. And when I draw my line to connect it, it'll barely be like an A-line shape. But once I put the elastic and it's gathered up at the waist, it'll be more of like that kind of shape. It'll be more like the A-line shape, okay? All right, so I'm gonna just go ahead and use my silver ruler. You can use a regular ruler or even a tape measure. I'm gonna go ahead and connect these points. So my 11 is here. I'm gonna draw down and connect right here. This doesn't even seem like 2 inches. I don't know why it doesn't seem like 11, 12, 13. I mean, it's 2 inches. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this. Let me interject this really quickly. The measurement that I have for how wide the A shape will be on this skirt is almost arbitrary. It's based on a skirt that I have, which has a shape that I really like. So mine is about 2 inches larger than the top measurement. Yours may be 2, 3, or 4. I would just suggest if you want to keep it an A-line and not necessarily a widely flared skirt, that you don't make it the bottom too much wider than the top. I'm gonna go ahead and make it a little bit wider past 13. It's like 13 and a fourth or so. And you can, yeah, I think you can see the white line there. So you can see the line giving the A shape for an A-line skirt, okay? And now, that's my basic measurements. For me, it's going to be a little bit variable how long this skirt is because I am gonna add a waistband, so that will be an additional 2 inches at the top. I'm gonna do a 2-inch waistband. So I'll do a waistband which will extend the length of my skirt, but then I'll do a hem, maybe just 5/8, maybe 1 inch. It just depends. So a lot of times when I make clothes, my measurements in terms of length with dresses and skirt just depend on the fabric. Like however much fabric is there, how much I decide I want to use. Do I want to add a waistband or include the waistband as part of the skirt, etc. For me, it could be variable, but you can get this measured down to a T. You can get the measurements exactly how you want. But I'm gonna go ahead and add some seam allowances on this edge over here. So what I'll do to get that done is measure out 5/8 at various points and then connect the points. So I'll count over to the 5/8 mark. All right, so you're a little bit closer now. You can see that I'm just marking my 5/8. And I'll show you this once I'm done. All right, so you can see this line out here that so I connected those points. And so this here is the seam allowance. So all this over here is my skirt. And then this part is the 5/8 seam allowance. All right, let's see how these scissors cut. Okay, I need to say this. This skirt also needs a seam allowance at the top. Because I'm cutting it on the fold at the top, I kind of just included it in my measurement. I'll include a drawing here to better explain. If I were not cutting it on the fold at the top, this is how it would look. I would add a 5/8 seam allowance at the top. And if you do decide that you want to do a fold on the left and at the top, like I'm doing with the green fabric, you can go ahead and draw in a seam allowance and just let your skirt go lower on the fabric so that the seam allowance is at the top near the fold, and then you'll cut the top fold open. It used to be my favorite scissors, but they've gotten dull over the years and I haven't sharpened them. And currently my other scissors are misplaced. I'll say that. But I have children who are usually messing with this stuff. These seem to be working pretty well today. These are very nice. These were a gift from my late husband about 10 years ago. Okay, so that did pretty good. And so I have my skirt shape. And as I mentioned, this is folded. There's 2 pieces, but I need to cut them in half so that I have front and back. So let me line this back up. And here we go. We have 2 pieces, and because it was on the fold over here, once I open it up, if you're larger, smaller, in between, whatever, you just get the measurements right, and once you add the elastic, it's gonna all come together. I've made garments for all sizes, all shapes, heights, etc. And it's just all about the measurements, okay? And you know, of course, some styles may look different on certain body types or body shapes, but I'm just making the point that you can make this even if your hips or waist are larger than what I'm doing right here. Just do the measurements. Okay. So these are my 2 pieces. Now, this is fine. This is going to be a cute little A-line skirt. But I like to do something to my garments sometimes when it's just plain fabric. I like to add other pieces of fabric to give it a little bit more character, I guess. And the 2 types of fabric I typically like to do that with are African print fabrics and batik. I just use scraps of those and create like design on the skirt. But I currently do not have either of those, so I'm going to be using another fabric I have. But before I do that, let me fold this back up. Let me fold this back. I'm going to show you how to cut the waistband. All right, so this is how I'm going to do the waistband. I have some fabric here that's left over from my skirt, or just the same material that I used, and I'm gonna double this over to cut 2 waistbands, one for the front, one for the back. I want my waistband to be 2 inches wide, okay? When it's finished, I want the waistband to be 2 inches wide. So, because the waistbands fold over and you put the elastic in between, you pretty much sandwich the elastic inside of the fabric. That means I need for my waistband, my cut waistband, to be 4 inches wide, because 2 plus 2 is 4. And I also need to add 5/8 seam allowance, okay? To match the 5/8 that I did on the edge of my skirt, at the top of my skirt. I am going to fold this fabric over, and because I like to really be conservative and save fabric and not have too many scraps, I'm going to try to fold it. I'm going to fold it to exactly what I need, okay? And because I'm cutting 2 for front and back, 1 for front and back, that is why I am doubling it over. Otherwise, I would just do it with this and cut out 4 5/8 inches for my seam allowance, okay? So, let's push this back. Let's fold this down. And let me measure it to make sure I'm getting the right amount. So 4 inches, 5/8, 4 5/8 inches. So that's 4 3/4. It's a little bit too much, so I will reduce it by just, and that's about right. So 4 5/8 inches is what I'm going to be doing. So I'll just measure it a few points to make sure that it's about right. Adjust it a little bit. Okay, so that's going to give me my 4 5/8 inches. I'll have the seam allowance on the edge to attach to the skirt, and then this will be folded in half, and I'll show you that. So I just need to keep this like this and cut. Okay. All right, so this is it. This is 2 waistbands. I have the fold over here. We will cut this across here. Okay, and here are my 2 waistbands. And when they are sewn together, the finished one will be 2 inches. It'll be about like this. So it'll be like this. Finished, it'll be about 2 inches, and that'll hold the elastic that I have. All right, so I mentioned that I really like to use African print fabrics as well as batiks when I create designs on skirts that have more plain fabric. I have neither of those, but this is some fabric that I've had for a long time. This is a rayon fabric. It's a type of challis fabric, very flowy. See, I have a rip right here. But I'm going to use some pieces of this to create a design on the skirt, and this kind of gives you an idea of what I'm going to do. So this is just a quick look at what I'm doing here. I cut some strips of fabric from the material that I showed you, and I like to just lay it out on the skirt in a way that's pleasing to my eye. So I have a wider piece here and a thinner piece here, and I'll just play around with pieces on the fabric until I see a placement that appeals to me and that I like, and then I pin it into place, and then I'll go sew it onto the skirt. And I typically use a zigzag stitch on these edges here because these are raw edges. I never really turn them under. I guess I could do that, but I kind of actually like the raw look, and sewing it with a zigzag stitch will kind of keep it from fraying so much. So there will be some fray to it, but the zigzag will help with that a bit. And this is just kind of one of my signature things that I like to do with skirts, typically when I'm using just a plain fabric. This is just one of my design methods for skirts and dresses. So I wanted to show you that. I'm going to play around with this on this piece, and I'll do some on the other piece as well. So with this technique, what's important is to just keep my fabric flat and make sure that my contrasting fabric that I'm sewing the strips from is not moving around too much on the fabric. I didn't do any interfacing on the back of this. I could have done that to make it a little bit more stable, since this fabric is somewhat loose and wavy and it wants to move around, but I didn't do that. I'm just being sure to keep my fabric flat and sew the zigzag stitch down each edge. And the way that I pin this on here may not be exactly the way that it ends up, and I'm okay with that. All right, now I sewed all the way down this edge, and I'm doing the other edge. And the trick when I go to the other side is keeping this from being bulky in the middle. I want it to be flat, but it tends to want to kind of like pile up in the middle like this. And I just do my best to keep it as flat as possible. Okay, so I have completed adding my strips of fabric to the skirt, and I'm going to show you the next steps. Basically, it's just about assembling the skirt, doing the seams, and putting it all together. Okay, so I've done the steps of adding my strips of fabric to the skirt to give it a little bit more pizzazz. And now it's just about assembling the pieces and putting the skirt together. So basically now I'm going to talk to you about seams, because it's time to assemble the skirt. And I'm going to show you a couple of options. There are more than two, but I'll show you two for doing the seam on the skirt. And I'm just going to show you a sample before I do the real thing. I just have two pieces of fabric here, like a rectangle or a square shape, and I'll sew these together. Okay, so I sewed the seam together. Okay, and you can do a few things with this seam. You know, you always want to be creating quality products, whether it be for yourself or other people. Just always try to create the best quality you can. Now, typically, what you will find in like off the rack garments is that the seams have been serged together. And I'm going to show you an example of a seam that's been serged. Okay, I have a pair of linen shorts here, and I'm going to show you how serging looks on garments. And you've probably seen this in your clothing as well. You use a machine, a particular kind of machine, to create this serged edge here. And I hope you can see it because the thread is the same color as the fabric, but you can see it there. Now, I have never owned a serger. I have had access to sergers in various situations and environments, but I've never owned one. So I've never done serging on garments that I've made when I was designing clothes. So what can you do if you don't have a serger and you want to create like quality garments where the seams are taken care of? One thing you can do, sometimes seamstresses teach it this way. You basically just iron this open and leave it, and just leave it that way. Just ironed it open. It is so windy today. I hope you can hear me. So I just ironed the seam open, and then I'll go ahead with assembling the skirt. And when I get to the hem at the bottom or adding the waistband at the top, this will remain open when I sew, you know, like fold the edges down and sew or attach the waistband. Another option is if you have pinking shears, those are the scissors that have the jagged edges. You can do that. You can cut, you can trim the seam with pinking shears and it'll create like a zigzag edge. And supposedly that will prevent some of the fraying. You know, sometimes the main thing you're doing when you're treating a seam is to help prevent fraying down the line as you wash the garment and different things like that. So you can use pinking shears. You would do that before you iron it open. So you would do the pinking shears, then iron it flat like I did before. Another option is to just do, you could trim this down a little bit first, or you could just leave it this way. And you could do a zigzag stitch along the edge and then iron it to one side when you're attaching the hem, when you're attaching the waistband and doing the hem. So you could just iron it open, like leave it ironed open. This is if you don't have a serger or you don't want to use a serging machine. You iron it open. You could do pinking shears first, then iron it open, or you can zigzag the seam together. I had mentioned you could trim it down first or not. I'm just going to start zigzagging as close as I can to the seam line where it's stitched, and then I'll just trim some of this off. This is kind of like makeshift serging, I guess. Now, I did not use a wide zigzag on this. I probably should have, but you can see where I did that, and now I'm going to trim this extra fabric off. Alright, so this is what I am left with. And then if I open up my two pieces, like we're going to pretend like this is the skirt, the side, and say if this were the back of the skirt, I would just iron this to the back. I ironed it that way, and that would like just take care of my seam, and I would go ahead and attach the waistband up here and then hem it at the bottom. Okay, so I did this little sample. We're just going to pretend like one edge of this is the waistband and the other is the hem. So you can see my seam in there that I've zigzag stitched, and I have it ironed to the back. So let's see. Or I have it facing toward the back. So if this piece were the back, my skirt would, you know, basically be like this. And this will be one side, and I could hem this side or do the seam on this side as well. But you can see that looks pretty neat. That's pretty good for home sewing without a serger. You can do your edges like that, and then go ahead and do the hem and the waistband, or you know, whatever kind of closure you're gonna do. And that, I believe, is good quality home sewing if you just have a machine and no serger and you want to do that. I think that will work. Now, I am going to show you what I like to do. Okay, so many years ago, I started doing French seams. I felt that it made the items look much more neat on the inside and gave the seams a nice finish. Now, with the French seam, what you're essentially doing is encasing the raw seam allowance between fabric so that it does not show. Now, I have left 5/8 of an inch seam on the skirt. This is just a sample. However, when you're doing seam allowances, you could really, if you plan to do seam allowances and you know that, you can really just do a 1/2 inch seam allowance, because when it's all said and done, that's essentially how much of a seam allowance you'll be sewing. So because I already incorporated 5/8 inches into the skirt, not really thinking about doing seam allowances initially, what I'll do is go ahead and sew the 5/8 and then trim it down to 1/4 and then do the encasing. So I'm going to show you that on this sample. Okay, so I've trimmed my seam. Something I forgot to say, which is very important. Typically when you're sewing garments together, you're sewing right side to right side, so that when you're done sewing the seams, you can turn it right side out and your seams are on the inside. Okay, now maybe you can hear me better without the sirens. All right, so I've trimmed the seam down. to about 1/4 of an inch. And I think I mentioned this, but let me reiterate because it's very important. Typically when you're sewing right sides together, so that when you turn the garment right side out, the seams are on the inside. When you're doing French seams, you start off with the wrong sides together. Because of the way that you're going to sew the seam, you need to start with the wrong sides together so you can end up with the right side showing out. So in my little sample here, all of the this fabric, but all sides are the same. There's no difference. So I'm just going to pretend that this is the right side and this is the right side, which means I've sewn the wrong sides together. If I can find a crayon or something, I'll mark this. So I've sewn wrong sides. I'm gonna just put a big W here. I hope the lighting is okay. It looks kind of dark, but okay. So that's wrong, and then we'll do R for right. So on my sample here, and you're gonna see this better when I do the skirt because I have sewn those golden pieces on it. On my sample, I've put the wrong sides together. You can see the W's I drew on there with white crayon. And so my two right sides are now showing outwardly, and I've sewn my seams together. This is not typical when you're sewing. You always want right sides together. Now, the next step with the French seam is to encase this raw edge in fabric. And the way that you do that, and this is where the wrong sides together will make more sense. You need to open your fabric up so the wrong sides are facing you and you just see the seam. You don't see the seam allowance, but you see the line down there. You see the line in the middle. And you're going to be encasing that 1/4 inch seam allowance like this and sewing this closed, sewing down here. And then when you see, these are the wrong sides, and then when you're done doing that, you're gonna just have a seam on the right sides, which is what we want. So let me do this and you'll see. Now I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to iron this real quick to make it easier. Okay, so I've pressed this. I've ironed this. Give me a second, my wrong side's out. And I'm just going to sew a seam right here, which is going to close in my raw seam allowance. And I'm going to do that in 1/4 of an inch. I'm just going to follow the edge of my presser foot. It's about 1/4. There's my seam, and you see how this seam looks. This is the seam right here. There's no raw edge. It looks much neater. And this is the wrong side, so it's where it needs to be. It's where it needs to be. If I open up my fabric, I'll move this over. If I open this up, there's the seam on the wrong side, and here is the right side. Now, if I had not trimmed my seam down far enough, or if I hadn't sewn my seam at the right distance, you would see pieces of the raw edge sticking out from this. I've had that happen before. You would see raw pieces sticking out between this seam right here. But I did pretty good this time. And there's my seam, and I think it's much neater. It's called a French seam, and I think it's a much neater seam, particularly when you're doing lightweight fabrics. I should mention that. If you're doing like chiffon, like a chiffon dress or skirt or top, or anything that has that's see-through, I think a French seam is ideal for that. As I mentioned, I tend to use it just in general, making things, because I just like the way that it looks, and that is how you do it. So your raw edge is encased, because essentially what it comes down to is when you're creating your seam and finishing your seam, you just want it to be as neat as possible so it won't be unraveling when you wash it and things like that. With regular wearing, it could ravel as well, and then you end up eventually you may end up with a seam that's coming open. So let's get started on the skirt. I have my A-line skirt. I have two pieces here. You can see where I've sewn this on here. So I've created a right side to this fabric, because before it didn't matter which side. But because I've done some top decorations here, it has a definite right side. And because I want to create a French seam, I am going to go ahead and do that and put the wrong sides together. A-line skirts can be tricky. Make sure you're not sewing it upside down. Like, for instance, on this, because the top is so wide, it may look like it's the bottom. So just don't get it mixed up, because we're doing elastic, the top is going to be wider. It's going to be the hip measurement. But you can see the different, I mean, I don't know if you can see it right now, but when you hold it up, you'll be able to see that one edge is a little bit longer than the other, or wider than the other, and that's your hem, okay? So just don't get it mixed up. Be mindful of that. I've done it before. Everything I'm telling you is because I've done it before. I've done it. And I'm sure I would do it again, okay? Now, I've sewn my pieces together upside down, etc., etc. I've done it. And it's frustrating. So let's sew this at 5/8, which is what I added, and then I'll trim it down. All right, so I sewed this seam at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm gonna trim it. Now I'm using this burgundy fabric. I feel like I can get away with that because I have this color in my contrasting fabric. But typically I would try to have green fabric to match, green thread to match the green fabric. But today I'm gonna let it slide. I think it looks good. I'm not always like matchy, to be honest. If I don't have a certain color, I just get the thread that I do have that's closest to the fabric, and keep it moving. If the seams are on the inside, I think it's okay. But always keeping in mind, if you're going to be selling clothes to other people, customers, they have other ideas of what quality is, and they may not want a pink skirt with 5 different color threads on the inside because you didn't have pink, so you may just need to get some pink. And to some people it doesn't matter. It's just a matter of preference. But I would say just use something as close as possible. Okay, so I sewed my seam together and I trimmed it down. You can see I trimmed it here. I think I'm gonna trim this a little bit more, and then I'm gonna do the seam on the inside, on the wrong side here. And even just in this moment, sewing these pieces together, I'm like, oh, am I doing this right? Do I have the correct size together? Because it's like when you're used to sewing, wrong or right size together, sometimes it takes some mental adjusting to be able to sew wrong size together. So I'm going to turn this way and just sew my seam. I don't think I'm going to iron it first this time. I'm going to just try to get it done. Actually, I will iron it. Give me one moment. All right, so I ironed the seam. As much as I didn't want to, as much as that rebel part of me was like, just sew it. It's like I can still hear my professor from 20-something years ago, like, iron those seams, Like, you try to take a shortcut, but you want your things to be nice. So I went ahead and ironed it first, and that's going to help me sew it better also. Just having it be flat, and I can feel that cut, that seam in there that I trimmed down. I can feel it. And I'm going to go ahead and sew this at 1/4 of an inch. I'm just going to be following the presser foot. Now, when you iron this, now see, I just made a mistake. I didn't iron this well enough. I kind of did it quickly. And what it did was it created a fold. I don't know if you can see. So I ironed it, but it created like a little ditch. It created like these 2 folds here. What I really need, so that my raw seam on the inside doesn't show through, I really need this to be, I need the seam to be like here. Like, I need it to be on the outside and not like the way I ironed it. So when you're ironing, just make sure that you're like right here is pretty good. Yeah, you see this? I don't want these two creases here. So I just kind of rushed it when I was ironing. But I'll be able to manipulate this with my hands. But just FYI. As I go, I like to show you the things that can be done better. You know, I'm not perfect, so. But I'm just gonna push the seam out with my finger because I want it flat and I want the seam to be like on the edge. That's gonna make a difference. Well, let's see. Here's the moment of truth. How did we do on the... Okay, this is what I want to show you. This is what could happen when you're doing a French seam if you don't have this ironed or like, you know, pushed with your fingers, have the seam in the right place. So you see right here, this could also happen if you don't trim your seam allowance down low enough, but I did trim it down low enough. But when I realized that didn't have it ironed correctly, I was already down here. So at the top, I don't know if you can see, but there's a little bit of the seam sticking out. There's a little bit sticking out right there, okay? And I don't like that. I don't like it at all. But down here it's really good. Oh, right here too. And I knew I messed up right here because I could feel myself sewing through the seam. So what I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna go back over this and sew it again, trying to like conceal that. And on the next seam, I will do better. Okay, so I sewed a second row of stitching. I started not quite at the top, but you can see right here. I started about right here, and I just kind of went over a bit so I can catch all of that, the raw edge that was showing through on the other side. And I went all the way down to where I thought, to make sure I was catching it all, because I saw like a couple areas where it was peeking through. And then I met my line back up with the original stitch line right here. So I have like an extra row of stitching here, and then it meets up back down here because I know like from here on down it's good. Okay, and so let's turn this the right way and see. There should be no seam there should be no seam poking through. I think it's pretty good. Yep. Okay. All right, so that's one side. I'm gonna go ahead and do the other side. All right, I sewed the seam together, and now I'm just trimming it down to 1/4 of an inch. And let me just repeat, be mindful when doing French seams, be mindful of what you're doing. It is going to be very frustrating if you make the mistake of sewing right sides together, then trim the seam, then realize I just sewed the incorrect sides together, okay? Because what you've done now is you've cut your seam allowance down. It's going to be hard to recover and do what needs to be done in terms of the seam allowance. Now, once you realize you're doing the wrong thing and you want to correct it, you've cut your seam. Now, there's a way around. I mean, it can be worked out. So, but it's always best to just do it the right way from the beginning when sewing, because once you cut this fabric, it's cut. Okay. All right, so I've sewn the seam and trimmed it down to 1/4 of an inch, or about 1/4 of an inch. And now you see my skirt is together. I don't know if you can see that. It's basically together. And I am going to, you see my seam right here showing on the right side of the skirt? Well, we can't have that. So let's go ahead and turn this inside out and sew the seam. Now I am going to iron this again, and this time I'm going to do it more carefully. I'm ironing this seam, and I'm just being careful this time that the seam is like right on the edge. There is no extra fabric like you know, on the sides of this. I need it to be folded in half almost exactly. Okay, and then I'm going to iron this in place. Got a lot going on right here. And I'm just going to have to manipulate it with my fingers a bit. I am just trying to give you some steps to produce quality garments. You know, I've had my moments of rushing through things and just, you know, kind of doing it the quick way. But I just want to give you these steps to help you practice from the beginning. If you're new to sewing, just practice from the beginning, doing quality work. I think that's always a good thing. Okay, and here is my seam. Okay, so I got this sewn the way I need it. Something in my nail. So that's pretty much, and I can feel my seam in here, that if I sew it 1/4, it's not gonna like be on top of that raw seam that's on the other side. All right, so I have that seam done right here, and I did really good this time. There's no raw edges showing through my seam line, which is what I want. Well, I don't want raw edges showing through, I mean. And I've got the basic skirt here, and I'll show you that. All right, so here's my basic A-line skirt. All right, it's going to be more A-lined, A-line-ish once I put the waistband in, and the elastic will pull it all together at the top. You can see my design I did on here, just some of my patchwork that I like to do. Front, and I'm calling this the back. Okay, typically when I do this, I'll do maybe like 3 or 4 strips on the front and only 2 on the back. So this is the back. And as you see, these edges are raw, but I'm okay with that. It's gonna be fine. I've done the zigzag stitch, it'll be fine. I see it's just, that's part of the character. I will trim some of this off. But as I wash this, it's gonna eventually, it's gonna fray, but it's gonna eventually stop fraying at some point, and it'll be fine. Now I do the same patchwork thing with knit fabrics. Actually, I mostly do it with knits, and there's no need to worry about fraying with knits. But with the wovens, you will get some fraying. And as I stated, you could, if you want to do something like this, you could turn these edges under and press them down and then pin this on and sew it. But I kind of like the character of a little bit of fraying on this design. So here's my basic skirt, and the next 2 steps will be to do the hem at the bottom and then attach the waistband, and then we'll be done with the skirt. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and work with our elastic, the elastic that's going to be used inside of the waistband. My elastic is about 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch wide. And I'm going to show you how you can determine how much you need for your skirt. The first thing is to determine where you want the waistband to sit on your body, whether it be at the natural waist here or maybe lower. Like most things nowadays, sit lower on the waist. I don't know, maybe high-waisted things are coming back into fashion, but you can decide where you want the waistband to be. I'm probably going to just have it in this area here. So I'll just pull the elastic around me, kind of snug, like stretching it a bit, and until I get it into a position that's not too tight and not too loose. So if I keep going, it's kind of tight, but if I let it go, that feels pretty comfortable. And then I'll leave, I have it overlapped a bit here, you can see. I'm going to leave a little bit on to sew together. So just the same way that I have it overlapped is how I'm going to sew it down. So maybe about 1/2 inch to 1 inch for sewing over. I swear every time I'm doing a video, sirens start. And it's so interesting because it's such a quiet neighborhood, but I don't know, like lately there are sirens. We have people hiking up in the mountains, injuries. We have a lot of elderly people in the neighborhood who, you know, fall and things like that. So please excuse all the sirens that may come up in my videos. So it's overlapped, and I'm gonna just cut this off, and then I'll sew my elastic together at about I'm gonna do 1/2 inch, and that's how you can do it. So I'll let it go, keep here, mark with my finger, and then let it go, and then I'm gonna cut it right here. And this is my piece of elastic. This really did turn out to be one noisy video. It's almost like the apocalypse was happening outside. Just wait till the winds kick in later. But if there's any part that you can't hear, please let me know and I can clarify something that you may have missed. And that feels pretty good. So first of all, let me measure my waist area. It's kind of bulky here because I have a skirt and a shirt, but I'll just raise this up a bit. And when you're doing your measurements, make sure you're wearing like tight fitted clothes so you can get the most accurate measurement. So I'll raise the shirt up to cut out some of the bulk, and I'll measure over the skirt here. And my lower waist, I'm getting 34. And let's see what this piece measures. Okay, this is measuring about 27.5. And that 1/2 that's left over is gonna, well, actually I need 2 halves to do the overlap, because it'll take up 1/2 on this end and 1/2 on this end, which is about 1 inch. So essentially my waistband is going to be about 26.5. I'm sorry, my elastic will be about 26.5 inches, and that feels comfortable on my waist. So you just have to determine what feels natural to you. If you're sewing for somebody else and you don't have their body there to measure the elastic, you can just take their waist measurement where they want the skirt to sit and subtract, let's say, so mine is 34 minus 26.5. I would say 34 minus 26, 8, that's about 7.5 inches. Is the difference between what my elastic is and what my measurement of my body is. So you can do something like that. You can say, okay, I'll take the person's waist measurement and just subtract 5 inches or 4 inches or whatever. You know, it just depends. And elastic can always be adjusted. It can be tedious to do that once you get it in, but it can be adjusted if it's too tight. But this feels okay to me, so I'm just gonna go with this. The next thing I need to do is sew my 2 waistband pieces together at each end, and just create a seam on both sides, on both ends, and my seam will be 5/8 of an inch when I'm done. So I'll go ahead and sew these pieces together. So I sew the 2 ends together for the waistband, and now I have this little loop and this circle, I guess, of fabric, a band, front and back. And what I'm going to do, so in the waistband, I'm not going to worry about making my seams be all neat on the inside because they are going to be closed up. Essentially, what's going to happen is this waistband is going to get folded over like this. So you're not going to see the seams anyway. But what I can do is, trim them down and iron them open. Now, we are going to be doing our elastic in a way to where we're just going to sew it together on the ends and then sandwich it between this. But sometimes you do a waistband in a way that you're feeding it through the sometimes you create a waistband in a way to where you attach the waistband without the elastic, attach it to the skirt, and then you feed the elastic through, and then you sew it together on the ends. And if you're doing it that way, it may be helpful to trim these seams down as much as possible, because sometimes the elastic can get stuck when it's going through the loop. It can get stuck behind a seam allowance. So if I have this ironed open, and then I fold this down and I'm feeding my elastic through, it can get stuck. That's just something to keep in mind. That won't be a problem for us today. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and iron these open and then show you how we're gonna put the elastic in. Okay, so I ironed my seams open. I didn't trim mine down. I think it's gonna be okay, but that is an option. You can trim the seams down. I just ironed them open, and so what I'm gonna do now is sew my elastic together. And because I left about an inch for overlap, I'll do 1/2 on one end and 1/2 on the other. And I am going to sew an X across. That's typically how I do it, just to make sure it's secure. You can do zigzag stitches. You can sew three rows of stitching, but you just want to make sure this is secure, because once it's in your waistband, you don't want it to pop open. So I'm going to do an X. Okay, my thread just broke, so let me rethread the machine. It doesn't really like sewing this elastic so much, and I understand it's so thick, and this may not be the best needle for it, but just want to get it down. So we got the thread back in, and we're going to continue to sew the second leg of the X that I'm sewing on this elastic. All right, let me clip some of these threads. Okay, so let's see if you can see that, because yeah, I think it's, yeah, you see the X that I sewed on there, and that makes it pretty secure. Like I said, you can also do a few rows of zigzag stitching, or just some straight stitching, maybe a few rows. You can also sew a rectangle shape around. You just want to make sure you're doing it, you're sewing it so that it's secure. Although it may be fine, I don't necessarily recommend just sewing one straight line of stitching and letting it be. I think you should go for something a bit more secure, but it's up to you. So elastic band, and then our waistband. And what we're gonna do is open our waistband up with the wrong sides facing up. So I should see the seam. And I'm gonna just put this on the waistband. And of course, the waistband is the elastic is stretchy, and my fabric is not. So it's not, it's gonna gather up, and that's the effect we're going for once we attach this to the skirt. So you probably haven't seen me use many pins in this video, but this is one time where I am going to use pins to keep this secure. So I'm just going to sandwich this elastic between the fabric. Now, one reason I don't use a lot of pins when I sew is because I don't know where my pins are. I literally have 5 pins right here, and I've had like 200 pins before. But actually, I shouldn't say I don't know where they are, because I know exactly where they are. My youngest child took my pins a long time ago. Like, I mean, maybe 2 years ago. And she had this little plastic ball, very lightweight plastic ball that was hollow in the middle. And the ball has a little hole in it, and she sat there and stuck all my pins through that hole one time. And that's where they've been ever since. And I haven't bought any more pins. And so I just make do with the few that I have. It's literally like 5. Just make it work. Because my pins don't have the pins that I have don't have the ball on the end. It's just straight pins, so she could fit them through without any problem. They just went in. And that red ball, like, I see that ball around here every now and then. I'm like, I should just cut that thing open and get my pins out. But it's okay. Now I'm just getting back into sewing. There are so many new things, or they seem new, since I stopped really sewing. They have like little clips now that you can put on the fabric. I don't know. I don't remember any of that stuff, but do what you need to do. This step, it may give you, help your sanity if you do pin it like this. It just really helps when you're sewing it onto the skirt. And what you want to make sure of when you're doing this is that your elastic is not getting twisted inside the fabric, because that can happen. Okay, it's really a shame, but I am down to using needles as pins at this point. These are needles, hand sewing needles. But I just need a few more, pins that I do not have. Okay. And there. Now, you can see how much fabric there is versus the elastic. It's really gathered up. And that's how it's going to be, because this waistband fits my hip measurement, not my waist measurement, and the elastic is closer to my waist measurement, or at least where I'm going to have the skirt rest on my body, whether it be, it can be your natural waist or lower, just depending on where you like your garments to sit on your body. So this is it. This is my waistband. Okay, now you're going to see how we attach this to the skirt. So once again, make sure that you have the right side. So I want to make sure that I'm sewing my waistband to the correct end, because with this skirt, there's only a little bit of a difference between how wide this top part is and how wide the bottom is. And that's because I made my A-line pretty, narrow. It's not like a wide A-line. I didn't want it to go into being a flared skirt. I just want it to be A-line. So I only have a couple of inches between the measurement up here and the measurement down there. So it'll be easy for me to kind of confuse the two if I didn't have some sort of design on my fabric, or, I wasn't really paying attention. But on this fabric, I know that this is the top. But I want you to just be aware of that, you don't want to get your pieces mixed up, and you want to make sure you're always sewing on the right end of your garment. And if you were not, you would know it pretty soon, because we're going to attach this waistband, and if you were putting on the wrong end, it wouldn't fit. Okay, so now let's put the waistband onto the skirt. So because I sewed these little strips of fabric, I just need to trim these down just to get them out of the way so that I can access the edge of the skirt. And you probably, unless you do something like this, you won't have to do this step, but just need to trim off the part that's hanging over. All right, now you see what I told you earlier, make sure you're working on the right end, because that was actually the bottom of the skirt. This is the top, so this is where I need to be trimming down this fabric. So I'll do this really quick. Okay, now that I have my top edge ready to go, I am going to take the waistband and put it onto the skirt. So basically, I have my waistband here. I'm gonna pull the skirt up through the waistband, so it should kind of be in the middle. It should be, in the middle of the waistband. Oh, my battery needs to be charged. So basically it's around my waistband, and what I'm going to do is match up my seam. So I have a seam on each side of my waistband, and I have a seam on each side of my skirt. My seam that we did, the French seam, I want to push that to the back, and this over here is the back of my skirt. So here's my French seam, and I'm pushing it to the back so that when I sew the waistband on, this will be sewn down facing the back. So I have a seam here, and I have a seam here where my fingers are, and I'm just lining those two seams up. And then I still have my pins inside of my waistband. I'm going to take that pin out and put it between all 4 layers are 3 layers of fabric now. So now the waistband is attached to the skirt. And I'm gonna go around this whole thing and do that. I like to do my side seams, my seams first though. So on the other side now, I am going to find the seam on the other side of the waistband, which is right here. And I'm going to find the other seam on this skirt, which is right here. I'm going to push my French seam to the back that we sewed, and I'm going to line the seams up and pin them together, adjusting the pin that's already in my skirt, taking it out and putting it in all layers of fabric. The 2 layers of the waistband and the 1 layer of the skirt. Or in this case, it's more than 1 layer because I'm basically pinning it at the seam, but I think you get my point. Now I'm gonna go around this whole thing, attaching this waistband to the skirt, taking the same pins that I have in this waistband. I'm gonna take them out and get them on, and use the same pin to pin together the waistband and the skirt. Now, if everything goes as intended, this will be done with ease. Sometimes, despite your best efforts at measuring and getting everything accurate, you will find that you've got more skirt than you do waistband, or you've got more waistband than you do skirt. And sometimes it's just by like a smidge, like 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 an inch. And you can't get it to get on there, especially if it's a woven fabric like this that doesn't have stretch. If it's a knit fabric, you can make it work. That happens. That happens. If you find yourself in a position where, like, say, okay, I've got this thing all pinned everywhere else, but here I am at the end, and I've got like a situation like this. This is what's left of the skirt, but this is what's left of the waistband. And no matter how much I pull it, they're not going to go together. They're just not going to go. There's no stretch. In a bind, especially if you're using elastic and it's going to be gathered up anyway, you can make like little pleats to take up that extra fabric of the skirt or of the waistband. I find that usually for me it'll be the skirt if I have to do that. So I'll just make like a little pleat or a couple little pleats if I don't want it to be too big, or a few little pleats, and go ahead and sew it down and just call it a day. Because it happens, like no matter how much measuring you're gonna do, sometimes you're gonna have more fabric on your skirt than you do on your waistband, or vice versa, okay? But I'm gonna just go around and pin this, and then I'll show you how it looks once I have it pinned. Okay, so I just ran into the problem that I was describing to you. Here I am, I've pinned, and then I've gotten to where I put my 2 seams together. I don't want to adjust this because I want my seams to match up. But look, I have more waistband than I do skirt. So that means when I was cutting this, I cut my waistband too big somehow. Even though it looked like it matched up when I lay the pieces flat against each other, it's too big. So either I cut it too big, or when I was sewing this French seam together, I miscalculated something. So my waistband now will not fit onto my skirt in this little area between the seam and the last pin that I did. You can see the waistband here, like these 2 layers, and then this is the skirt. And it's like, okay, I don't have anywhere to go, like all this fabric. So, and over here it's fine, over here it's fine, it's fine. What I'm gonna do, which I didn't mention a moment ago, is I'm gonna take this pin out, the last pin that I did, and I am going to just ease this waistband onto the waist of the skirt. Now I told you, you can just go ahead and do some pleats and be done with it, make it fit. But this is another step. You can just like you can ease it in. You can undo the last pin you did and like distribute the excess fabric. So I took my pin out, and I'm just gonna go back the route that I just came and distribute this extra material into this section. So another option, I could just take this waistband off and sew up the edge some more, sew the seam some more, and make it more accurate to the measurement of the skirt. But there are several options. I just want you to be aware that it's not the end of the world if this doesn't fit. You have options. You can just choose one of the options. Sew some pleats in it and be done. Make it redistribute the extra fabric. You can take the waistband completely off and re-sew the seams so they fit. Those are the three that I can think of. I don't know how successful I'm going to be. Or you can be content with the seams not lining up together, the seams of the skirt and the seams of the waistband. But I'm going to do my best to make this work. And if I don't see that it's working, I'm just going to adjust my waistband seam, which looks like I might have to do that. Or maybe, I don't know. Let's see. Okay guys, now as I was filming the last segment, I realized what I did wrong and why my waistband was much bigger than my skirt edge. If you remember back when I was talking about French seams, I believe that I did mention that when you're doing a French seam, your seam allowance, you need to make your seam allowance be 1/2 inch, because you're essentially going to be sewing it at 1/4 inch and then encasing the seam at another 1/4 inch. So 1/4 plus 1/4 would be 1/2. Well, as I was drawing my pattern out on the fabric and making and including the seam allowance, I went ahead and did 5/8 because that's kind of the standard. I'm just used to doing standard, but I wasn't considering the fact that I was going to want to do a French seam. And so basically what I did was when I went ahead and sewed my skirt pieces together, I took up too much for the seam allowance. Because I had included a 5/8 seam allowance, that's what I sewed it at. And then I went ahead and encased it at another 1/4 of an inch. So that pretty much made my seam allowance be 7/8, which was way too much. So yes, my seam allowance ended up being 7/8 of an inch wide. That's almost 1 inch. And I just wasn't taking all of that into account when I was cutting out the pieces, and then like almost spur of the moment deciding I'm going to do French seams because I remembered, oh, I like French seams. So that's something to be aware of. If you're going to do French seams, just make sure that you start off with a seam allowance that's, I would say 1/2 inch. And then observe that seam allowance. Like take that seam allowance up when you're sewing and don't sew it at 5/8. But that's, like I was saying, the French seam is my preference. As I showed you earlier, you can do something like this, zigzag stitch your seams and trim them down, or you can just iron the seams open. You do not have to do a French seam, but if you do, just make sure you're doing the right amount of seam allowance. So I recognize the mistake that I made, and if you were watching this, you probably were saying to yourself, you know, if you have some experience with this, with seam allowances and French seams, you were probably saying to yourself, she's not doing that right, because I wasn't doing the measurements right. And it was like it hit me as I was making the video yesterday. So what did I do? So because I've already done my skirt, I've done my French seam, I'm not undoing this. I'm just going to adjust my waistband and just hope that this still fits up over the hips, okay? So this is the line right here. The top line is the 5/8 seam allowance line, and I went ahead and sewed a little bit more, about 1/4 of an inch, to account for how much smaller the skirt is than the waistband. And now I'm going to cut this off, and I'll have this more narrow seam allowance. Okay, so I've trimmed the seam down, and now you can see my more narrow seam allowance, and I've ironed it open on both edges. And so I'm basically just going to go back to what I was doing before. I have my band of elastic here, and I am going to put it around this fabric and close it in, basically encase it, and pin it again, and then pin it on the skirt. So I'll show you that once I get it done. So I have the waistband pinned to the skirt, and it fits so much better now that I resolved the issue of the seam allowance. So it's pinned on here, and I'm just going to go ahead and sew it together. I'm going to sew this at 5/8 inch seam allowance. And as I go, I'll just remove the pins. Now, when you're sewing this on, you just need to keep adjusting the waistband to make sure that it's flat, because it is bunched up because of the elastic. But you want to make sure everything here, you just want to make sure that you're keeping all the layers flat as you sew around. And so I'm just going to sew all the way around, making sure as I go I keep it flat. And also making sure that I have all 3 layers. There's 3 layers here, 2 layers for the waistband and 1 for the skirt. So I don't want any of the layers to kind of get lost from the stitching. You see, as I'm going, I have to pull the extra fabric back so I can keep this part up here flat, because it wants to bunch up naturally since this has elastic inside. Okay, and that's it. So I sewed the waistband on. So even though I made that mistake with calculation and with the seam allowances, I was still able to get this on, and it went on perfectly and smoothly that time without too much excess fabric in the waistband. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is clip some of my threads and then do a zigzag stitch on the seam that I just sewed, similar to what I was telling you can do with your seam allowances on the skirt. Just do the zigzag stitch if you don't have a serger, which I don't have. And I'm not going to do anything too fancy on the seam. I'm just going to zigzag it and trim it down. Okay, last time I did zigzag, my width wasn't as wide as it could have been, so I'm going to change my stitch width. Well, let's see. I get it mixed up. For zigzag, I'm going to change this number. Sorry. Yeah, the width, I'm going to make it, let's see how it looks at 4. So I'm going to change that to 4 to get a wider zigzag, so it's not as narrow. Alright, so I finished sewing zigzag all around my seam, and that's going to help it not fray as much. And so what I'm going to do is just trim off this extra fabric. I still haven't found my better scissors either, so using these. It's really, really important to have good scissors. I mean, you can make do with other, ones that aren't so great, but you'll have less frustration if you have good scissors from the start. Just be sure not to cut your zigzags. You can cut close to them, but don't cut through them. Okay, so I got it all trimmed down. This is the strip that I cut off, or the strips. And here's my seam trimmed down. Alright, so I did the zigzag edge and trimmed it down very close to that. And let's turn this right side out. Let's see the skirt. and I'll give you a better view of this. That's pretty much how it's looking. There's the waistband. Now, in the past, I've done many things with waistbands, and one that I used to always like doing was to sew, especially when it was gathered up like this. I would go around and sew a row of stitching, and I really liked how that looked. I like the look that it would have when it had that extra row in there, and you know, just gave it a little bit more character. I think I'm going to do that right now. One thing I forgot to mention is that it is important to tack your elastic down. So I'm doing this technique, and that's going to hold my elastic in place. Sometimes when you're washing garments that have elastic in the waistband will twist around, and you may have had a garment like that before where the waistband, where the elastic inside of the waistband gets twisted, and it's pretty annoying. And one way that you can help prevent that is sewing through the waistband so that you're sewing the elastic into place. And you can do that at the side seams of the waistband. You can just go right in the seam and sew a row of stitching to keep the waistband from moving around so much. Like I mentioned, with the technique I'm using right here, my elastic isn't going to be able to move because I'm sewing a decorative row of stitching around it, and that'll keep it in place. But you should definitely do something to just help keep the elastic in place inside of the waistband. Okay, and there it is. So it just kind of creates these gathers, just a different effect in the waistband when I sew a row of stitching through the elastic and around. So it's just a technique I used to do on some designs that I would make, and I wanted to give it a try with this skirt. So here's the skirt basically, and the only thing we have left to do is hem the bottom. Now let me measure this and see how long it is, because even though I started out trying to make a 22-inch skirt, you know, maybe it got changed somewhere along the way. So I'm gonna see how long it is, and then I'll just make the hem based on that. Yeah, it's about 22. It's about 23, which is good because I still need to do my seam allowance. So, but instead of doing a 1-inch seam allowance to make it equal, end up being 22, I'm just going to do a regular 5/8 inch seam allowance because that's what I left on the bottom when I was doing the pattern, doing the fabric. So what I'm going to do for the hem is iron down about 1/4, and then the remaining amount will be about maybe about 3/8 of an inch. So my hem will be pretty narrow, and I'm okay with that. If you left enough to do a 1-inch hem, I just recommend that you first sew down a little bit first and then do your hem, you know, so this edge won't be raw once it's, you don't want to just fold it up like this. You want to conceal the raw edge first and then do your hem, and ironing is going to really help with that. Okay, so I went over to my iron and I pressed down about 1/4 of an inch for the first edge. But something that I want to show you is, remember when I talked about having your seams face a certain direction? I have mine facing the back here, but let's examine this. So if I go look at my French seam, you see that it's sewed over in that direction. Initially it was ironed over, I pressed it down and it's facing, you can see the opening here, that direction. When I get to the bottom, to the hem, I want to make sure it's going also in that, let's see if you can see, in that same direction, as opposed to going in this direction, so that your seam isn't, you know, twisted or going a different way. Those are just some details to make your sewing look nice on the inside. Have your seams facing the same way at the top and the bottom. So I just wanted to point that out, and now I'm going to go back and sew down the rest of my hem, which is about 3/8 of an inch. All right, let's talk a little bit about the hem. So I did my 1/4 and then I'm folding it once again. And you can, okay, so you could have marked your hem already and then you would just have the marks here and you would know where to fold it. I didn't do that, so I'm just making sure, I'm just using my measuring tape. There are these small little rulers that you can get that makes this a lot easier. I used to have that, but no more. I'm measuring this to make sure that it is, I want it about 3/8 of an inch, and that looks about right. So I am just gonna eyeball mine all the way around to be 3/8 of an inch. If it helps you, please do mark your hem. So basically, before you do any ironing, you can measure out how much of seam allowance you left for the hem and mark. Now, this is the inside, but I would say mark it on the outside so you can see once you fold it up where the line is, and that way it'll keep your hem uniform all around. It'll keep it the same width, but I am gonna just eyeball it here, and that's about 3/8 of an inch for mine. And so I'm gonna go ahead and press this all around. So, but do what you need to do to make sure that it's even. You can also pin this down. I'm just gonna let the heat from the iron be the pins for me. And I'm gonna go all the way around here. Yep, that's about 3/8. So I'll do this all the way around, and then I'll sew it down. Okay, so I have my hem pressed down all the way around. Guys, I'm from the South. I'm from Louisiana, and it's very hard for me to say hem, but I'm really trying. H-E-M. Like I just naturally say him, you know, like the pronoun him. So it's just so funny, like when I hear myself talk, and I'm like, okay, yeah, it's just the southern twang in me. But I pressed my hem all the way around, and now I'm going to sew it in place. It takes my daughters to make fun of the way I speak. When my southern accent really comes out, they're like cracking up laughing. You know, they're born out here in Hawaii. They don't have the southern drawl that I have, that I grew up with. So it's just funny. All right. They really get a kick out of that. Now you want to sew this as close to the edge of your, I have not been doing a good job at this, but you want to sew this as close to the fold as you can, so it will look really nice and straight on the outside, and it'll keep this down. You don't really want it coming up like this. So from here on out, I am going to do better. And just sew as close as you can without going onto the skirt. It can be tricky if you're first starting, but with practice, you'll be able to do it. All right, so there it is. So as I went on, I got closer to the edge, and that's about how you should do it. Let me find my beginning point so you can see how kind of off I was to start with. So you see how much in on the hem I was at the beginning, just kind of sewing lazily, I guess. But toward the end, I got it together, and you can see. So that's what you should strive for. Get it as close to the edge as possible. Now, typically, I would take this little stretch out and redo it, but I'm just going to go ahead and leave it, okay? Okay, so here it is up close. Now, keep in mind that the bobbin thread, the thread that's down in here, that's the thread you're going to see on the right side of your fabric, okay? So for mine, I'm using this burgundy fabric on top and on bottom. Oh, I just looked up and noticed that I am, that my spool is empty. So this piece that's in my needle, once that comes out, that's pretty much it. So thank goodness I just made it through making this skirt. So your bobbin thread is what's going to show on the right side of your fabric. And then when you're sewing the hem, and then the spool thread is what's going to be what you see as you're sewing it. So keep that in mind if you're like, oh, I only have enough of, if you're sewing something pink and you want it to show pink on the outside, just be aware that if you don't have that much pink, then let that be your bobbin thread. Let that be your bobbin thread for sewing your hem, because that's what's going to show on the outside. If you want to use black on the inside, then let that be the thread you use up here. But always keep in mind that when you're sewing your hem, what you're going to see on the outside is the thread that's in the bobbin, okay? So I'm giving you that tip for those moments when you don't have enough thread of a specific color. Been there, done that. All right, so this is done. And I just need to iron this iron this skirt and trim some of this off. Like I said, I don't mind some fraying on this. That's kind of the style I'm going for. But I will trim off some of these long pieces. Okay, so I'm just going to trim some threads. And as I do this, I want to just talk a little bit about designing versus sewing. I always was the type of person as a designer to design as I go. Like if the idea struck me as I was making the garment, I'll use a certain kind of fabric here or change something there. And that's essentially what I did with this. As I was like, oh yeah, I want to add some contrast to this, and I went and found some thread that was a nice contrast. So, you know, when you're designing things, you can have a concept or an idea from the beginning, or as you go, you may want to change things as you move along. And that was always my way. That was always my style. Oftentimes, I let the fabric tell me what it wants to be, or what it might, what might look nice made from a particular fabric. So when I was envisioning doing this video and like just showing people how to make a basic A-line skirt, I was thinking that I would just come on here and make a green skirt. I have this nice green fabric. It's one of my favorite colors, so I'll use that to show people how to make an A-line skirt. But as I went along, like that designer part of me came out, and I wanted to do something a little bit extra to give it some some more character, to give it some more oomph, I guess. And yeah, so that's what I did. And I'm gonna be quite honest with you. I am a seamstress because I'm a designer. I have to be a seamstress because I want to make my ideas, I should say in the past, that's how I operated. I'm just getting back into this, and primarily to just teach and show people how to make things, not necessarily to be a fashion designer anymore. But I don't say that being a seamstress is my strong suit. I really see myself as just a creative person, a designer in many aspects of my life. And so knowing how to operate a machine and do these various techniques, which I've learned over time, that allows me to design the things that I want to design. So just wanted to share that. Okay, so there's so many strings, so many threads. Just give it a good shake. And I don't know, I may have made a mistake using this challis fabric. It's really, really stringy, but I really like the colors and how they contrast with the green. But it might have been more beneficial to sew these edges down. Even though I do like the fraying, it looks like it wants to go a little bit crazy. But maybe after I wash this one time, it'll be okay. Like I'll wash it and then trim it down, and it won't be as stringy then. But I really like the color combination. Yeah, it's pretty stringy on that side too. That's okay. I'm just going to trim it down and then probably wash it and see how it does. But this is just my touch to the skirt. You just use whatever fabric you want to use. You don't have to do all this extra stuff of sewing patches or strips of fabric on top. You just might have one nice print fabric you want to use, or one solid fabric, and that's what you use. So that's pretty much it for the skirt. I'll give you a full shot of how it looks. All right, and finally, here is the skirt. This is our A-line skirt. I think it fits pretty well. No problem going up over the hips. You can see the designs that I did with the fabric. And I think the only thing missing for me is pockets. That would be really nice. So I will definitely do a video of making a skirt with pockets. You can see the waistband stretches out pretty nicely, and like I said, no problem getting it up over my hips at all. It's a fairly easy design to make. And I hope my video gave you insights into how to do this. It may not take you as long as it took in this video. I do talk a lot, explain a lot. I like to be thorough, but hopefully this was very helpful to you. The part in the front is a little bulky just because of the nature of it with the elastic. But if you don't like that, you can just wear a shirt that kind of covers it up. But I'm okay with it. Okay, please let me know if you have any questions. You can see all my strings right there on the back from my patches. But thank you so much for watching.